Heap high the farmer's wintry hoard, heap high the golden corn, no richer gift has autumn poured from out her lavish horn. John Greenleaf Whittier. Welcome to this week's episode of Warfare, Advancement, and Revisionism. My name is Preston Floyd, and as always, I am your host. I'd like to thank everyone for joining me this week. I really appreciate the support. February is seeming to be as off to a big of a start as January was, so really excited and pleased for that. I didn't have too much in the way of feedback, so what I will be doing this week is just trying to finish up what I believe will be everything in terms of crop domestication for this season. And this will include the last couple of crops that we have still to cover from North America, and then this includes the fruit as well. And then we'll, of course, move into the few crops that are starting to be domesticated in South America. So, to that end, we will first start to talk about amaranth. Now, this plant entered English from the French amaranth, from the Latin amaranthus or amaranthus, depending, I guess, on the version of Latin you're looking at. And now, this Latin spelling, of course, is also from the Greek amaranthos, which is the name of the mythical flower. It was like unfading, unwilting, undecaying. So that's where the term comes from in English. Though, of course, it was called other things by other people well before it entered into the European lexicons. But the primary name I've found used by natives to those regions is the Aztec I'm going to butcher this, Huautli, or Huautli, perhaps. I'm not sure. Apologies for my nahuatl. There are other names for it in other languages, and older ones even than Nahuatl. The Mayan languages, for instance, called it either Tez or Etez, depending on the dialect. But I don't know that anyone grew it more than the Aztecs did. Some estimates claim it could have made up as much as 80% of their calories that they consumed daily. Now, part of the reason for this is how efficient amaranth is as a crop. A small amount of seeds plants a large area. I think if everything is goes well, you have healthy seeds, you have healthy soil, you have close to ideal temperatures and weather. You can plant 1 kilogram of seeds for a hectare, and this yields a very high amount of seeds. So basically, you get 1,000 kilograms or more per hectare. Now, amaranth is making a little bit of a comeback. It's gaining popularity as like a health or a superfood. That's one of those big fitness trends that they try every so often. Like, oh, this plant is the secret to health, and this is why our ancestors were so healthy, and yada yada. Even though these are gross simplifications, and usually that's not why our ancestors were that healthy, and in fact our ancestors are not that healthy comparatively in terms of nutrition. It's maybe some other factors that make them maybe healthier than us in some ways, but again, in many ways they're not. But that's kind of getting off topic, at least for now. But that is not to say that amaranth does not have useful properties in a crop, and ones that make it very effective and useful here today. It is gluten-free, which is something that more and more people, at least here in the Americas, the USA, and Canada too, for that matter, I believe, are becoming more and more gluten intolerant. Now, you also have the crop has a lot of dietary minerals. Calcium, magnesium, things like that. Now, the Spanish made an effort to promote other crops and tried to kind of discourage and eliminate amaranth's growth in traditional regions where it was being grown. And this is due to the religious connections to the faiths of those areas. Amaranth kind of is involved in a few important myths and ceremonies that these people were partaking in. But again, that's all stuff that we're going to cover in the future. So just keep that in mind. Now, there's a large number of amaranth species, probably surprising to a lot of people who maybe were not aware of the crop. Now, amaranth has around 75 different species worldwide. Some strains are grown and treated as grain. They're grown for their seeds to turn into flour. That's what we grow here in the U.S. In fact, these types are primarily grown in the Americas and South Asia. Now, there are other varieties of amaranth that are closer to vegetables, with their leaves and roots kind of being the primary reason for their cultivation. These varieties are more popular in Eastern Asia and Africa. Though again, there are areas in where it's reversed. They're not completely just ignored. That's not to say that there's no grain amaranth grown in Africa, and that's not to say there's no vegetable amaranth grown in the Americas. There is kind of a balance to some of these things. Now, there are also varieties of amaranth that are weeds, and they will overgrow an area and smother other plants if they're not controlled. It is not something that is completely, helpful and beneficial. There are downsides to amaranth, or at least certain species of amaranth. Now, it is generally believed that amaranth is domesticated at a couple of different times. First in Central America, and then in South America. Now, the domestication in Central America happens right towards the end of this season, right around 4500, 4000 BC, BCE. Now, there are some debates that are fairly interesting. I don't know how accurate some of the claims put forward on about how and when amaranth spread out of the Americas. And I was going to kind of dive into it, but I've decided to hold off as evidence for when it possibly appears outside of the Americas, even if it somehow did leave the Americas at the time. Some people make these more dubious claims. It's still not happening until another couple of thousand years, at the very least. So I'm going to hold off on that now. Maybe there will be some new research, some actual evidence, some genetic stuff that we can kind of discuss. But as of right now, we just need to know that it's being domesticated in Central America. And that leads us into another piece of domestication that's happening at around the same time, and that is the first fruit trees domesticated in the New World, and that is the avocado trees. Now, the avocado derives from the Nahuatl language, again Aztec. They called the tree Ajo Aqua Huitl, and its fruit Ahuacatl. And again, apologies to any Nahuatl speakers that I may or may not have. Now, the Spanish, of course, they called it something similar. They basically pronounced it as they heard it, which was something close to aguacate, or aguacate, or avocate, depending on, I guess, the dialect of Spanish that they were speaking. And that is, of course, what we obtained in English. Excuse me. Now, the fruits, of course, had been consumed by people almost as soon as they began encountering the trees. And this, but the domestication probably didn't start till right around 4000 BC, is when the earliest evidence of purposefully like planting and growing the trees began. Now, it is debated on this happened at a single site in the Tehuacan Valley in what is now Mexico. And then it was further refined, and breeding of different varieties happened in neighboring areas, and that's how you get the different varieties of avocado. If its originator is this one place in Tehuacan, or did there exist 3 or 4 regional areas where domestication of slightly different wild species took place? And one of those would have been the Tehuacan Valley, but there have also been places like in Guatemala, or what is now Guatemala, and I believe Panama as well was another place that this may have happened. Whatever the exact case, there has been crossbreeding between various varieties for centuries since this happened. So I guess in the grand scheme of things, it really doesn't matter if it was the single domestication event that spread, or if it was the multiple domestication event that then combined together and then re-spread out. It's hard to really say. Now, we're going to move on to North America, or we're going to finish off North America. And to do that, we're going to talk about maize or corn. And I maybe should have covered this as one of the first plants when talking about the Americas, as it is the oldest after squash and the other cucurbita, excuse me. But as I was trying to keep episodes balanced on time, I figured that this one may take up a little bit more discussion than some of the other episodes. Say if I had just included avocado last week, it maybe only been about like a 20-minute episode. But of course, that might not work out this week. This episode might end up being a lot longer. But best laid plans of mice and men and all that. Now, corn is from the Old English corn, which meant like a single seed of a cereal plant, or seeds of cereal plants generally. Like if you talked about all cereal plants, you would just call them collectively corn. Now, this probably entered into English from the Proto-Germanic kernum, which meant small seed, which is from the Proto-Indo-European root grino. And kernel comes from this same etymology. Like a kernel of corn, that type of thing. Now, early colonists from Britain, when they got to the Americas, they would call the plant Indian or turkey corn. Now, of course, as time passed and the colonists and their descendants adopted to growing the plant, the superlatives were dropped, and it just became known as corn. Now, the name maize, which is another term that you'll see a lot of people use for corn outside of America, it is a Latinization of the Taino word maize. It literally means life-giving seed. And virtually every native language family has their own term for the crop. And I already touched on the area where the plant was domesticated, I think, last season. But as of now, the evidence shows that it was somewhere along the Balsas River Valley where the domestication of maize began. And this involved planting and crossbreeding 4 different strains of wild Zea ancestors known as Teosyntes. And when I say Zea, that's the scientific name for maize. It's Zea maize. Zea, of course, is the Greek word that was actually used as for spelt that we talked about for the European crop. So they it also is related to giving life. So it's kind of a redundant scientific name. It's life-giving maize. So life-giving seed, essentially, is what the scientific name means. And the term teosyntes is like the wild maize strains, which still exists in certain places. And they do not look at all similar. If you were to look at a wild teosyntes and, of course, modern corn, you would have no idea how closely related they actually are. Now, of course, when they first started planting these wild strains, they did not realize that they would be able to manipulate them in much the same way that the people first planting barley, rye, things like that. They obviously didn't know how easily and how radically altered these plants can be, and we've discussed earlier, as time goes on and more understanding control of plants emerge, eventually this starts to give rise to newer and more diverse breeds of plants. So first, of course, they're trying probably to increase the size of either the kernels or the amount of kernels or seeds that these plants are producing. And then later, as time goes on, they're probably trying to get strains that are more suited to different environments neighboring the ones that they're naturally found in. And again, this is a process, and for a few thousand years, the maize being grown is a tropical plant and will remain so. It won't move into North America for quite a while. And even today, with even more cold-tolerant strains, they're still limited in range to where they can be grown in the U.S. They have to be planted. Even these cold-tolerant strains, they have to be planted early in the spring. Otherwise, they're not going to survive in some places, that long into the year. So, if you want a healthy, abundant harvest, you need to plant corn early. At least the more north you go, the earlier you have to plant it. Also, part of this as well is not just weather susceptibility. Corn is also extremely susceptible to fungus. In some cases, more susceptible, I think, than some other grasses and grains. But further north, funguses can grow. At least the ones corns are susceptible to, they can grow in a lot of different places, and in some cases they grow better in, I think, colder environments. Now, corn will be able to be exported to the south, and this does happen in a couple of ways. The first of these diffusions happens this season, sometime between 4,500 and 4,000 BC, where it will reach the western side of the Andes Mountains. And a number of people will start growing it there. However, it isn't grown in vast quantities, at least from what we can tell from the archaeological record. And this is true even as time goes forward. And a lot of the harvests of corn are believed to be tied to, or at least a lot of the harvests of corns are believed to have been earmarked for the creation of alcoholic beverages like chicha, which is, I believe, the one that is the term in Mexico for corn beer or corn liquor. And these types of beverages are used much like beer in Mesopotamia and wine around the Mediterranean basin. So this beverage is used as not just a social lubricant, but also for religious purposes. So a lot of what corn was grown in, at least in this first stage of diffusion, was grown in areas that it may not have been best suited to. but it was grown because it was so versatile and useful for creating, this great alcoholic beverage. Now, when it comes for foods to survive on, the South Americans have plenty of their own domesticates to survive on. So this special crop from far away, this maize, it's not surprising that they maybe don't necessarily keep it around, in large amounts, aside from just the religious and social aspects of said crop. And speaking of course, domesticates in South America, it is time to move on to discuss those crops arising in South America. Now, we already discussed beans last week, and it does appear now that there was 2 domestication events in the Americas, one in Mesoamerica and one kind of in the Andean highlands with beans. Now, from genetic tests, it does appear as if a lot of the Andean or South American beans eventually got kind of crossbred with the Mesoamerican bean, which led some to believe that the Mesoamerican bean is the originator. But again, there have been earlier finds since then that kind of disprove no, there was a separate domestication event, and it kind of got subsumed by the more dominant variety of the Mesoamerican beans. But that's happening kind of at this point in time. We also have potatoes that are being domesticated, and this is also happening in the Andes. Now, etymologically speaking, potato comes to English from the Spanish patata, which itself, I read a couple of different explanations for how it came about. Some claim that the Spanish word is just from the Carib language, the one I think they said that was initially spoken on Haiti, which was batata. Although I did read also that it was a combination of a Taino word, also batata, and the Quechua, which was one of the languages in now what is Peru and Ecuador, papa. So it was so it was a combination basically of the Taino word and the Quechua word. I'm not sure which is correct. I will say that the Carib/Taino word, batata, means sweet potato, and the Quechua word is more of what we would consider like a normal potato. But regardless, the origin in English is the same. It comes from the Spanish, who either got it from one native group or another. It's not a term they invented wholesale out of thin air. And that leads us to something that's, again, we talked about sweet potato and potato. There are an extremely large number of potato varieties. There's over 5,000 different varieties. And if you live on the, west coast of South America, you'll run into quite a large variety of these. Worldwide, I think a lot of the ones grown outside of South America are variations of, or descended from varieties from, I think, what is now modern Chile. And that, of course, again, we'll get into this more in more detail later, that did become a problem. Being so reliant on one specific strain of potatoes kind of does set you up for disaster if there's a specific blight or disease that affects one variety of potatoes. Now, of course, as we mentioned, there are sweet varieties and starchy varieties, and this is actually something that we'll talk about with another type of crops. But this is something you run into a lot with tubers of all varieties, not just potatoes. So the potato's value and importance cannot be overstated in terms of um, um, nutrition, cultural significance. Like, this is something that's extremely important to people living on the western coast of South America for pretty much all their history. Like, their local variety of potato is important, in addition to whatever else is nearby them as well. Um, and I've read a travel log. I forget who the name of the person was, but he said if you wanted to pass a couple of hours, and you were in, speaking to some of these native peoples living in those regions, just ask them about their local variety of potatoes, and you could kill a good portion of your afternoon just talking about it and why theirs is special and different. Now, potatoes are technically, I think, a nightshade like tomatoes. So that does mean that they do have a certain level of toxins, which is dangerous for human consumption. But, if you're stored properly and you make sure that you don't let them get exposed to too much light, and they don't have those little green sections that sprout the tubers and things like that, generally speaking, you're going to be okay. You don't have to worry about it too much, as long as you cook and prepare them properly. And of course, another thing with potatoes, they can, like a lot of tubers, they can be kept in the ground for long periods if you want to allow them to continue to grow. You don't necessarily have to harvest them at a specific time. They're not like grains. They don't necessarily rot quite the same way. You have to have them out of the ground by a certain point. You have a little bit more leeway with that type of thing. And speaking of potatoes and tubers, that does lead us into another crop that is being domesticated in South America. This is closer to, Brazil, somewhere in the Amazon basin. But it is also a tuber, domesticated a little bit later than potatoes, which could have possibly been domestication could have started there, possibly last season, but very definitely has already grown out in proportion fairly quickly in this season in terms of how widespread it is. But the crop that starts domestication this season in the Amazon basin is cassava, or also known as manioc, is another term that you will see for it. Now, cassava comes to English from either the French cassave, the Spanish casabe, or the Portuguese cassave, or cassave, excuse me. And this is from the Taino word kakabi. And I think initially in English it was spelled with a Z, so it was kazabi is the initial English spelling for it. Now, this is, again, a tuber. It comes in two varieties, a sweet and a starchy variety. It is like potatoes, also has potential to be toxic to humans. But it does have a couple of properties that potatoes don't. Their tapioca, one of the key ways it can be made is from cassava extract, the starch. And that was used not just for human food, but also animal feed, which, of course, there's no tapioca from potatoes, at least as far as I know. Obviously, you have mashed potatoes, but that's not really kind of the same thing. But if anyone is aware of a potato version of tapioca, please let me know. I'd be very interested in reading about it. Also, I believe that the leaves for cassava can also be used can be used for more purposes than potato leaves and flowers can be. Of course, you can also use it to make bread, much like potatoes. So cassava is kind of like the eastern South American variety of potatoes. And today it's grown well outside of South America. It's a very important crop in West Africa. I think it's the most grown crop over all of the West African nations. It's a very important famine food when things are very desperate. It's a very good crop to kind of have as a backup to what you maybe are used to in terms of food variety. Although I do think there are some situations where people will essentially risk eating the more toxic varieties in times of famine. So just keep that in mind. Cassava can be dangerous, and it is more dangerous, I believe, on the whole than potatoes. Though how great that danger actually is, especially these days, I can't really say. But this crop is, again, it is domesticated slightly later than potatoes. Next, we have chili peppers, or just chilies, depending on if you're a stickler for that kind of thing. Now, these are actually one that was domesticated in a couple of different places. I think right now the earliest evidence shows that they were first being consumed wild in, again, the highlands of the Andes, somewhere between the Peru-Bolivian borders in modern day. And this is one of the regions where you see a lot of early agricultural activity in South America. But interesting to note that chili peppers don't really show up kind of in the archaeological record till about 7,500 BC. And it will take another couple of thousand years before their domestication starts, right around 4,500 to 4,000 BC. So they may not have been very popular, or they may have just been something that was eaten on occasionally, not something that you'd take the time to cultivate. But that being said, they're very useful for a number of things, including seasoning, making food taste better just in general. Also, I believe there is evidence of them being used for possible medicinal purposes, or at least parts of them are. It's also important to remember that while they do have capsaicin, there's probably not anything that is extremely spicy, like some of the ones that have been developed today, like the Carolina Reaper or the Infinity Chili or the Dragon's Breath or things like that. These are extremely out of the ordinary peppers, just designed specifically almost to cause pain in some cases. But that being said, they were experimenting very early on with increasing either heat, savoriness, sweetness. That's why you see so many types of peppers and radically different varieties all throughout South America, Mesoamerica, and I think even there are places where it got to in North America as well. I need to double check that. But I think some of the earlier pre-Columbian exchange peppers, you have bell peppers. I think jalapenos were prior to that as well. Cayenne. Those are all close to varieties that would have existed in the past. And of course, you can use it as oil. They probably used it as a drizzle in certain situations. You also have, you could also use it as a deterrent for certain types of animals, to stay away from your food. If you put the powder or the oil on other types of crops, it would keep some animals away. So chilies are very important, and they when it comes to spreading out of the Americas, once the Columbian Exchange happens, peppers are extremely popular, and one of the bigger driving factors in getting European interest in the region. And we'll get into that later with like the pepper trade from the old world peppers, and why lack of that in Europe was kind of a big factor in exploration. But again, that's all far in the future. Also, I forgot to mention, chili is from Nahuatl as well. It's an Aztec word, and it is, again, talking specifically about the variety of chili that they had access to. So that's where we get the term in English from Nahuatl, which, of course, we heard the term from Spanish, which doesn't seem like they heard it too differently from what the Aztecs were actually pronouncing it as. And it didn't even get corrupted too much here in English. Although I think, of course, we added pepper to the end of it because it was similar in terms of what it was doing for food, flavoring, that kind of thing. Now, that leads us to our final crop, at least as far as I can tell from research, but if anyone thinks I've missed anything, or in any region, please let me know. But the final crop that we're going to be discussing is one I sort of mentioned when talking about Asian domesticates, and that, of course, is cotton. Now, I'm not going to go over the etymology again. I recommend you go back and listen to that if you missed it. But New World cotton is a little bit different from the cotton trees found in India, the Indian subcontinent. And the kind of cotton that we're discussing here is what probably most of us are familiar with when we talk about cotton. The cotton plant, or the cotton, I forget the term for it, but the non-tree cotton. Now, there are a couple of places where this could have originated in the Americas, but right now, evidence shows that the earliest Gossypium cotton plant is the barbadense, and this was originated in what is now Peru. I think it's a place near Ancon is the name of the location in Peru. And this can be dated to around 4,200 BC. So it's, again, this appears to be domesticated strains, so it's very probable that this can date back anywhere between a couple hundred to 1,000 years. And this plant, the barbadense, is going to become extremely important, not for any food reason, but for creative reasons in terms of not just clothes, but also art and things like that, or at least artistic expression, if not art as we would understand it. And it is a vital backbone of a number of cultures that are going to arise in this region. Growing cotton is going to be a valuable economic factor, not just a survival factor, which is probably what was driving people when they were first, harvesting the crop. It gives people something aside from leathers and skins to wear, and this is happening even before domestication is happening. And I'll go into this some more when I talk about when we move to animal domestication. But from what I can tell, it looks like crop domestication took place in South America before any kind of true domesticated animal arose. And we'll get into reasons for this. Part of it is because of the types of animals that are living in the area. But it's not like the Middle East or North Africa. There are not these wild, in India too, there are not these wild animals that are being domesticated first and then slightly later, crops are at the same time. It appears, at least in the Americas, crops first, animals second, as opposed to either animals first, crops second, or animals and crops simultaneously. And one of the big talking points that we'll have for this region for, I believe, this upcoming season is the Norte-Chico civilization, or as it's sometimes called now, the Caral Supe civilization, I think is a newer name for it. Now, I think they emerged this season. If not, they will emerge slightly after it. But they're one of the big proto-civilizations here in the Americas. But we'll get into them later. But yeah, I think that's the main crops that have been domesticated. But again, if you guys have anything that you think I've missed or anything you'd like to ask me about, please let me know. You can, of course, reach out to me at waradrevpod@gmail.com. You can direct message me on Twitter/X, or you can comment on any of the YouTube videos. I get all of those comments, and I do review them all, even if I don't necessarily respond to them all. But when it comes to the podcast, I generally have responded to all of them. So, but yeah, please, any feedback or constructive criticism, I would appreciate very, very much, as would any kind of rating, sharing. That all helps the show out immensely. But yeah, so next week, again, we will be back with the first animal domestication episode of this season. Won't be nearly as many animal domestication episodes, I don't believe, as plant domestication. I think 2 to 3 at most. But yeah, thank you all for joining me this week. I hope you have enjoyed this episode, and I will see you all next time. Please have a great rest of your day and your week. Thank you all. Goodbye.